of violence. As a house go up, our house must come down.
On April 23rd, SDS called a demonstration in which we plan to demonstrate inside Low Library to protest Columbia's complicity with the Institute for Defense Analysis, its racism in building the gym in Morningside Park, and its attempted suppression of the left by disciplining 6 students. About 500 people joined us at the Sundial.
It's been 2 days. We've taken 5 buildings: Hamilton, Low, Avery, Fairweather, and Math. If we've got the administration figured right, they're up to calling the cops. And when they do, we want to be here.
There's a world struggle going on, and we're all part of that. And we all must recognize that. We must all adopt an internationalist line and relate to our oppression and exploitation by the same power structure.
Idea came about 3 years ago in Watts. I mean, the idea of dumping garbage somewhere else, where some guys in Watts picked up garbage and dumped it in Beverly Hills.
Suppose a cultural exchange, garbage for garbage. America turns the world into garbage, it turns its ghettos into garbage, it turns Vietnam into garbage. In the name of universal principles, democracy, human rights, in the name of the fatherland, collie dogs, New England churches.
As the leaflet says, throw the garbage at Lincoln Center and, if possible, disrupt the proceedings in the most unpleasant way that we can.
It was a way of sort of finding out what we were up to as a group.
We'll not negotiate with it or let it take our ships. But we are faced with a revolt of the garbage, a cultural revolution. Garbage Right Life has discovered itself. And we of the Lower East Side have decided to bring this cultural revolution to Lincoln Center. Is not Lincoln Center where it belongs?
There's a garbage strike and there's a transit strike and things like that, that young people really groove on it because it cuts through what they consider to be the shit and misery anyway. And you know, like when you have garbage on the streets, a lot of young people think that it's not a crisis. In fact, it's something that they'd like to see continue. And people never thought of how they could use that and organize people and just do things during those situations. The old left has the mentality that when you have a crisis, you want to solve it. And when we have a crisis, we want to extend it.
I think that the demonstration is successful if it unleashes, not among them, which I certainly never expect, but among us and among people that we might be able to influence, kind of an energy. And if it can express a certain kind of radicalism and extremism in a way that is, that spreads.
He's already had a busy day attacking.
And it was shocking and it was awesome.
Morning on a scale that will shock and awe.
Shock and awe.
Shock and awe.
If you have to ask, is this shock and awe, you're not seeing it.
Today is a national day of action against the war on Iraq. And we are saying, as long as they're making money from genocide, no more business as usual. Thank you very much. I got to go to jail now. Take a picture of this guy in the hat.
Expressed a concern about our safety with the cops. Is there anyone else who feels that being the first group, we may be in danger of more violence than usual?
I think because the media is here, the chances are, we talked before, there's less chance of being attacked by the cops.
Lock arms like this in single file and walk out into the street. Right underneath.
And I'm here because people with AIDS live in the streets in New York City. And that's the policy of this administration. It's not a mistake. It's the way Koch has it set up. And we're here to say if they're going to live in the streets, we're going to block the streets too.
All right, so that showed some of the footage from the 1968 Columbia Revolt, the 1980 Palestine Protests at the UN, the 1968 garbage demonstration, which will be different than the garbage offensive that we will talk about soon, but related, 2003 Iraq War protests and the 1988 protests. So now we will go into more detail about some more specific protests.
While he's pulling that up. Hi all, my name's Sam. I use she, they pronouns. I am not in leadership, but I'm a member of the three groups that brought this to you, Red Rabbits, Anti-War Working Group, and the other one, Racial Justice Working Group. Sorry. So I'm gonna start talking to you about the Palestine protests from the 1970s. I think in many ways, who here in the past 6 months has been to a Palestine protest? So it's something that brings a lot of us together. And I think also it's something that the fact that these protests have been ongoing for so long is kind of what brought this idea about, because I don't know how you all felt while watching that footage, but I saw a lot of similarities to today. And so we really wanted to just like look back at how these actions took place in those days, what's changed, what's the same, what can we learn from them? So this footage was actually from the NYC Municipal Archives. It was created by police surveillance because it was legal at the time for the police to surveil any potential threats to the peace and safety of New York City residents. And of course, this included any type of protest for civil rights, just because they were able to. And that didn't just entail the protest recording that we see today, but also it really gave them right to identify organizers and follow up on them. And basically they had like way more jurisdiction, police had way more jurisdiction to just follow organizers and do whatever they wanted to. So if you go to the next slide, so this was eventually deemed unconstitutional in 1985. So that's why all of this footage became public. But this is all taken from different, well, it's from police recordings, but it might remind you of recordings that happen today on body cams, and also the TARU unit of the NYPD, which I actually don't know what it stands for. Can someone tell me what TARU stands for? Does anyone know?
I don't remember what it stands for.
Well, the TARU is who you might see at a protest with a camcorder. They're a legal part of NYPD recording actions, so they have that footage and have technical assistance response unit is what it stands for. Totally what you would expect it to be, right? So you might have seen cops recording you because they're part of this unit, or always cops these days have body cams, which were, a reform to protect us, except they often conceal this footage and don't actually release it to the public. So it was kind of like upon stumbling on this footage that we got the idea for this for this event. So we're going to have discussion questions later, but this is just something to keep in mind as we go through.
Hop over to the next slide. Hey all, so my name is Ada. I use she, her pronouns. In addition to some of these other protests, we wanted to include some of the early mass strikes for tenants' rights as we try to think about what is the socialist intervention in a protest movement, and how do we bring socialist politics into how we protest things and what we are protesting for. As many of you will know, tenants had really no rights for a long time, and we had to fight for them. You know, even things like lease renewals, things that we now wish we had more of, like rent stabilization, all of this was stuff that had to be fought for by tenants. So we can pop over to the next slide real quick. I find it really interesting. In the early 1900s, tenant organizers and tenants themselves would organize into these massive groups to go on strike through the early 1900s to try to get better rights. They would get together like thousands of tenants to do these huge strikes and withhold their rent, specifically requesting repairs because conditions in the building were often horrible, or even requesting lease renewals, and eventually working to fight for things like, maximum rent cap increases, which we now know as the rent increase caps, which we now know as rent stabilization, and which we have since lost for the most part. Most of us probably, or many of you might, because you're all smart socialist people, but you might not live in an apartment that's rent stabilized anymore. You might live in an apartment where your landlord can raise your rent whatever they want every year. So in the early 1900s, around 1907, 1908, there were a series of really large strikes across the city where thousands of tenants would go out, withhold rent, and demand housing security. And they were organized by tenant organizers and self-organized as well. In a lot of those early strikes, small fractions of them would win. And a large strike in 1908, out of 10,000 tenants that went on strike, 2,000 of them actually got the demands they were looking for. But that is great for those 2,000 people and probably worth fighting for those 10,000. And it led the way for larger strikes in the 1920s, where people were able to actually win rent stabilization. I thought this was an interesting way to frame how long some of these fights take and the ways that we can sort of we have to continue to build and flex these organizational muscles. You know, people who first were organizing in the 1908 strike kept organizing through going on and eventually they were able to win some of this. So we can move to the next slide. So this is a photo of the Young Lords Garbage Offensive from 1969. If you're having a hard time seeing on that or the image, it is a whole bunch of trash strewn out across the street to block traffic. We talked about a related action that was done in California during the video. This was done up in Harlem here in New York. So the Young Lords, for anyone who wasn't aware, were a group that was active through till today, but they emerged in the 60s and 70s and were similar to the Black Panther Party and were organizing uptown in New York. So the way that this developed was that East Harlem was being neglected by the sanitation. We can go next slide. Harlem was being neglected by the sanitation department and trash was not being collected and people were fed up with this. So they developed this to tackle the issue. They got the idea specifically to tackle the issue by interviewing people in their neighborhoods where they lived about what are the issues you're facing? What are the things that we need to tackle to make working people's lives better in this city? They took to the streets with brooms and they just swept all of the trash into the streets. They dumped out trash, set it all across the intersection. And as someone put it in one of the interviews I found, a lighter and matches appeared somehow and a lot of the trash went up in flames. And they blocked the streets and encouraged cars to respect the blockade. And so in doing this, they forced the sanitation and the department and the police to arrive and deal with the trash that they had been neglecting for so long. We can move to the next one. So they chose their location because it was a main, like this happened repeatedly. And in the area that they chose, they did it throughout the same area, which was a main thoroughfare for commuters going into the city. So they chose it because it's going to cause a bunch of problems for the city and also for the people who they're, I think that they felt the city was neglecting maintaining their neighborhood in favor of making things easier for commuters, like putting big highways through the city and other bullshit like that. The name Garbage Offensive was an homage to the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, launched against the US military the year before, which is a cool little internationalist aspect to it that I like. And the campaign also coincided with the mayoral race, and they were able to force this as an issue on the mayoral race that people had to debate. And this occurred these demonstrations occurred regularly, so they were able to continue forcing this issue. And eventually the city had to buckle to the pressure and start doing proper sanitation pickup in these neighborhoods.
Okay, so in terms of more recent protests, again, you all probably have, experienced them, and we're going to start with Occupy City Hall in 2020. So as some of you may have been in New York City, some of you may know, in 2020, protests erupted across the country. There are not an insignificant number of protests globally as well, but this was in the wake of the murder of George Floyd by a police officer named Derek Chauvin of the Minneapolis Police Department. So these protests have consistently been pointed out as some of the largest civil rights protests in history, and based on the large number of people who have participated. So in these protests across the country, we saw a wide variety of tactics. So we saw sit-ins, vigils, moments of silence, really large, massive street demonstrations, and also confrontational showdowns between police protesters, some including the city, including the burning of police vehicles, as well as the burning down of the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis. And in New York City, similarly saw this spectrum of tactics. And so one that we wanted to highlight here was Occupy City Hall. So this was one where it was a 24/7 occupation right outside of City Hall. It was also called Abolition Park. And this was holding the space in the weeks leading up to the city budget passage. It was grew from the demand to defund the police, which is an emerging demand from these uprisings. So the encampment grew over time, as you can see in this picture. There's a lot of people there, and it grew to be like a central grounding, metaphorical but also physical space to inform many arms of the protest movement. So yes, the people who marched the streets that summer, but also as a hub for things like what is the world we want to see. So it included mutual aid, a training ground, and education. So we saw a variety of different activities that happened there. Okay, cool. So again, not going to go over in too much detail, but we selected these because a lot of the focus that we have seen, a trend that we wanted to pull out of the recent protests in Solidarity with Palestine, are those that are targeting cultural institutions in their complicity in either taking Zionist funding, propaganda, and aiming to perpetuate, a lot of the lies that, are endangering people in Palestine. So the two that we pulled out here on the left-hand side are an deoccupation of MoMA. So I don't remember how many. Was it like 500, 800? How many people ended up being there?
Over 600.
Yeah, over 600 people. Got into MoMA, held space, and it was one where, again, you see right here, we were pointing out how MoMA is complicit in genocide. Oh no, and the trustees of MoMA fund, what we're seeing in Gaza. The right-hand side are a few pictures from, I think this time is still running away from me, probably 3 weeks ago, I think at this point, where people also, I think this is maybe the second or third deoccupation of the New York Times, where there was an escalation, where people occupied the lobby, and the intent was to, not only propagandize around the fact that the New York Times is actively perpetuating war crimes by publishing just, again, false allegations as to what's happening in Gaza, or just not covering it at all. And also the timing of it was also to, tell employees, right, don't go to work, quit your job. You are complicit in this as well. All right, for the next one, I'm going to pass it back to.
Yeah, and we're not showing it here, but this New York Times action, I'm sure people saw, was also in conjunction with like an earlier action that day, where they like physically blocked with like a dump truck with like rubble, like rocks and stuff, the distribution plant in that morning. Both actions like very deliberately blocking both people and the distribution from happening.
Yeah, and interestingly, after there were no arrests at the distribution center, there were about 120 arrests at the New York Times office. We just received word that the DA declined to prosecute all of those cases. So 120 people back in the streets. Shout out to jail support and legal support for helping make that happen, and the comrades for their courage. The bridge and tunnels action, some people might be familiar with the latest version of it from January of this year. A coalition of organizations shut down a number of key exits and entries to the city, a number of bridges and tunnels. A lot of folks got arrested, and the NYPD was kind of sent scrambling with so many large groups in so many different places throughout the city. And this was actually a callback to an action or a series of actions in March and April of 1995 with a coalition of CUNY folks, unhoused people, healthcare workers, AIDS activists, people with disabilities, and families of people killed by the police, shutting the city down to protest a lot of the same stuff that we're protesting now around budget cuts and police brutality. And similarly, the action at the end of last year shutting down Grand Central, led by Jewish Voices for Peace, was sort of anticipated or drew inspiration from ACT UP's occupation in 1991, where they shut down Grand Central as well. So this is another example of taking a transit hub, a highly visible sort of commuter center node in the city that a lot of that gains a lot of visibility and also causes a headache for people in power. In order to raise awareness for the causes that we're working for. And I will just briefly note, not pictured here, but maybe worth mentioning, were the Jordan Neely protests around this time in 2023, where we saw some of the most energy around police brutality in the streets in the last couple of years. And organizers escalated and ended up occupying subway tracks. And following that, those militant actions, we saw sort of the first wave of NYPD escalation in some years, where they began to specifically target organizers, specifically target people using amplified sound without a permit, which we hadn't seen them doing for the last couple of years.
So what's going on next? First of all, we want to do more study of the history of protests like we've been doing. And the next thing a few of us have talked about wanting to do is to reach out to some of our older comrades, people who have actually been here throughout the movements over years. They have lots to share with us, and we are hoping to get together a panel to talk to some of our comrades who have been at this for a long time and who can share with us, and they'll probably have fun stories and cool stuff. If you have an idea for who we could reach out to about this, or if you want to help set this up, talk to one of the 5 people you see up here afterwards, and we can work on that all together. In general, we want to hear from you about these meetings. We want this to be a collaborative space where we can talk about how we as socialists are participating in protests, planning things, coming up with ideas, learning and reproducing our practice and theory around fighting capitalism in the streets, I guess. So you can reach out to us at antiwar@socialist.nyc.
All right, so before your daily enrichment time. We have one more video to play. David, do you want to come introduce it?
Sure. I also want to real quick sneak in the stack that I didn't get to say about, well, just to uplift the stuff that like Occupy City Hall and jail support and what Robert was saying about like meeting and socializing with other groups. I have found those spaces to be places where like real authentic trust and like community is built across organizations and formations. So that like durational space of occupations and jail support is actually sort of this other important part to all the stuff we're talking about. But what I think I was called up here to talk about was this video that we put out, or someone put out recently, about the disband the SRG protests that have been happening the last couple of years, disruptions to the budget hearings with these squeaky pigs, which I think came about because if you've been to a lot of anti-police protests in the last few years, you'll see these squeaky pigs are abound and are something that are just bother the police and also kind of underscore the absurdity of what we're up against, these pigs, and the violence that they show. And these protests that have been, thank you. And these protests that brought this sort of whimsical defiance to this hall of power, directly countering the police's brutality that we see all the time, I think was an interesting juxtaposition of their violence and also like our capacity to bring joy and creativity and to our subversion. And this is, I think, also connects to the propagandizing we can do around our actions, where they are moments of space and action, but they can live on in how we counter the sort of evolved media system. So this is just content warning. The first half is kind of rough to watch. The second half is really fun. It's only a minute and a half, but yeah.
Protesters shouted and used noisemakers.
The use of squeaky toys, you will be removed. You will respect this body. You will respect this body. Back 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 this body. Please have them removed. You will respect this body. Listen. Apologies. Excuse me. Listen. You will respect this body. Back this body.